Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Bill Rogers. A former FBI agent and police instructor, Bill Rogers is the founder and chief instructor of the Rogers Shooting School. Bill has been a world-ranked IPSC shooter, a state trap champion, and has over 50 years of shooting competition experience and over 40 years teaching shooting. Bill has invented many of the holsters and equipment used by police and military worldwide. He also invented the target system and the method of instruction used at his school. His teaching methods are utilized by some of the most highly trained tactical teams and military units in the United States and throughout the world. I was first introduced to Bill's teaching methodology during a pre-deployment spin-up while in the military. The facility we were training at put my team through an abbreviated version of the Rogers range, and I was completely humbled initially, like embarrassed with myself. The targets appeared and disappeared before I could even recognize I was supposed to do something. It made me appreciate the limitations of training on stationary cardboard targets. By the end of the day, however, I was in a flow state I'd never quite been able to duplicate on the range. The environment created by Bill's targeting system had me doing everything I was supposed to do without conscious thought, which is the point of training. Whether we like to admit it or not, sometimes coaches, teachers, and medical providers, despite noble intentions, screw people up, and their pupils, if they succeed, do so in spite of their instruction, not because of it. Less is often more when it comes to skill acquisition. With proper environmental facilitation, less verbal feedback or instruction is required because the brain is adept at solving problems if we don't interfere with how we generally learn. Bill's insight transcends shooting and has far-reaching implications for anybody trying to maximize contextually meaningful skill development. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's podcast in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests. Here's Bill Rogers. Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to come on. I wanted to begin by asking you about the difference between traditional marksmanship training and how you would prepare for a law enforcement officer or military operator for combat shooting.
Well, we refer to the conventional type of training as precision shooting, and that seems to be the system that's taught by just about everybody for basic shooters all the way up until advanced shooters. Now, precision shooting requires a lot of different things. First of all, it requires a stabilized target. The target can be moving, but it has to be moving at a stabilized speed. And the shooter has to be stabilized. The weapon has to be stabilized. A sight picture has to be acquired, and we talk about the fact that we need to refine that sight picture as much as we can. And once that's all done, and remember, part of that is that the shooter himself stabilizes, controls his breathing, tries to eliminate any kind of movement, and then he starts what we call a press motion on the trigger to achieve what we call a surprise break. And a surprise break simply is that the subconscious part of his mind is not aware of exactly when the weapon's going to fire, and we can go into later explain why that is physiologically. But in any case, that's what a precision shot is, and that's what most people are taught to begin with. And about the fastest that we can accomplish a precision shot is right around 1 1/4 seconds. That's the fastest that any of us that are really skilled and trained can produce a precision shot. Now, when I'm talking about a precision shot, I'm talking about with a handgun at maybe 10 yards to shoot like a 1-inch or 2-inch group. That's what we're considering a precision shooting. Now, the alternative to a precision shot is what we call a reactive shot. And a reactive shot, the best way that I can explain a reactive shot is to talk about shooting live birds or trap or skeet or sporting clay. And so when I ask in a lecture, when I pick out somebody, I say, so raise your hand if you've shot live birds or skeet or trap, and then I'll say to them, so is the target stabilized? Well, no, the target's not stabilized. Is the shooter stabilized? No, the shooter's not stabilized. The bird's moving up and down, and as soon as you start to shoot, they take evasive action. The shooter many times has got to move quickly to get a clear shot. And so then I say, so do you have a perfect sight picture? No, I don't have a perfect sight picture. So then the final question that I ask them is always, well, is there a press of the trigger? And of course, the answer is no, that you pull the trigger as fast as you can pull the trigger, and so that then describes the difference between precision shooting and reactive shooting. In reactive shooting, nothing is stabilized. Target's not stabilized, we're not stabilized, the weapon's not stabilized. The sight picture is not precise or refined. It's only refined well enough to make the hit of the target. And we don't press the trigger. There's no such thing as a surprise break because we're shooting the weapon subconsciously, and the subconscious part of our brain has already has a solution for this shot well before the shot happens. And when the mind recognizes that the solution is there, then it initiates the shot, and it's an instantaneous action. And so therefore, when the brain sees this target, whether it's a live bird or whether it's a clay target or whatever, it's traveling 60 miles an hour and it's 25 yards away, and it's going at a 60-degree angle to us. The brain, when it sees the proper lead on this target, it pulls the trigger instantaneously. Now, the question is, how does it learn? Well, the way we teach the subconscious mind anything is through repetition. And so the way actual actions, and so the way that we teach it how to do it correctly is through correct repetition. So the first time that you go out and shoot a clay target or a live bird or whatever, you're not likely to hit that target. But there's a system that we call positive instant recognition, and it's what it actually trains the subconscious mind to do any eye-hand coordinated skill. I don't care whether it's ping pong or tennis or football or soccer, any of these sports. The way we learn is riding the bicycle, skiing, snow skiing is an important one. The way we learn this is through trying the skill and having instantaneous feedback that the mind recognizes. So what we've learned through lots of studies is that the part of your brain has got to be able to recognize the results of your actions within about 300 milliseconds of that action. So I'm saying that in this case, we're using a clay target that's being thrown 60 miles an hour. So you swing the weapon out there and you pull the trigger, nothing happens. You swing the weapon out there and you pull the trigger, the target breaks. Well, in shotgun shooting, the targets are relatively close. So you're talking about 20 or 30 milliseconds from the time that you pull the trigger until the target breaks. But if we can get that feedback information up to like 300 milliseconds, then the brain can actually make a memory pattern. It's like a mental trace. It's like a map, and it can reproduce that. And the more we do that, then the more the brain is capable of reproducing that skill. And that's a different situation than training the conscious mind how it deals with certain skills. And so in the type of reactive shooting we're talking about, is the subconscious mind is in control of the whole event, basically, once we decide we're going to shoot. And then the subconscious mind runs it, and it's all based on prior experience. So you have to start by teaching someone, and again, if you were to take them to a skeet range or a trap range or any kind of clay target range, you're going to take them to sporting clays. You would start off with throwing the targets at the same speed, and you would try to encourage them to shoot and encourage them to pick out the lead. But once they have fired enough rounds, once they fire the round and hit the target, then if you could maintain that same target and throw it 5 or 6 times in repetition, then the subconscious mind then learns exactly what it feels like. And that's the way we learn all eye-hand coordinated skills. So the difference in the way we would train a person in reactive shooting is, like my range system, all of our targets are moving. they come from a position of cover and they expose themselves, and then they move back to a position of cover, or they go to another place of cover. But they're only exposed for very brief periods of time. And the time that we expose them is what we call human response time. And I don't think we have time in this one to talk entirely about human response time. But response time is made up of two components: reaction time, where your brain recognizes something took place, and then the movement time is what is required to fulfill the drill. So in baseball, someone's throwing a ball at 90 miles an hour. So the brain recognizes that the ball is capable of being in the strike zone, and it has a very limited amount of time to swing the bat and connect with the ball. And so we can actually figure out what is humanly possible because we know what the average reaction time is. It's right around a quarter of a second, and we know that the simplest movement time is right around a quarter of a second. So, in essence, for us to accomplish about the fastest drill that we can talk about timing, and that's baseball or shooting trap or skeet or shooting a handgun, about the fastest time when we're actually steering the weapon or driving the weapon. We're not starting aimed at the target. We actually have to start the movement, track the target, and then engage the target. So about the fastest time that we can do that is right at 2 response times, or a half a second. So what we do at our range is we run these targets a sub-second. So the close-up targets, we run them at a half a second exposure. And when I say close-up, it's like 10 yards. And so as the target gets a little further out, we add a little bit of time because we find it's necessary for the brain to understand that it has to stabilize the weapon and have a little bit more refined target or sight picture when we're shooting at a greater distance. And so we can go out almost to 25 yards and still be able to engage small targets. And when I say small, we're shooting at the largest target is like an 8-inch diameter target. But some of the targets are smaller because only a portion of that target is being exposed behind cover. And so what it teaches someone is that they've got to be able to engage this target much quicker than the 1 1/4 seconds or 1.5 seconds that we see that everybody else is training at. But the only way they can learn this is by getting this positive instant recognition. So what we do is we shoot at our targets. Our targets are painted with white lucite paint each drill. And so when you connect with that, it's just like breaking a clay target. The brain instantaneously knows that it hit the target, and it knows precisely where it hit the target. It's not good enough to know that you hit an 8-inch diameter piece of steel that's moving. It's important to know precisely where you hit that 8-inch diameter piece of steel, because what we're trying to do is teach ourselves that we're shooting at something that's precise, something that's relatively small. And so our focal attention is on essentially a relatively small spot that we're trying to shoot each time. And so by doing that, we can improve ourselves so that we ought to be able to center hit an 8-inch diameter plate at 10 yards in a half a second. But if we have that same skill, when we take it out to 20 yards or 21 or 22 yards, we're just hoping that we can hit peripherally on that target. But still be able to hit that 8-inch diameter target. So that's in essence how we train, and the difference that we train. The problem with training on a cardboard target is, in most cases, if it's greater than like 10 yards away, we really don't pick up with our peripheral vision. We don't really pick up the hit of the target because we're concentrating on the front sight or in its relationship to the rear sight. And if we're doing that, then the target's a blur. And so if the target's a blur, we sometimes don't be able to pick up that hit on the cardboard. And so we really don't know what we're accomplishing. And because we don't know until the end of the drill, we walk down and look at the target and count the hits and so forth. And that's well past our 300 milliseconds. So the only thing that does, that encourages us to shoot the precision shot, which is everything stabilized. We take the same amount of time to shoot a target that it's 10 yards away or 25 yards away. It makes no difference. We're always looking for a stabilized situation, stabilized sight picture, and then we initiate the press to get what we call a surprise break. And the reason that we are trying to get the surprise break is because the real problem that we have in teaching our type of shooting is that subconsciously, all of us are concerned about the concussion. And the concussion from a handgun is greater than it is from a shotgun, because the closer the closer the concussion source is to us, the greater it is, because it dissipates by the cube. It's going in all directions. And so the problem is that when a handgun goes off and is relatively close to us, we perceive this concussion. Now, the problem is that we acquire that concern about concussion at an early age in life. And just basically, by the time we're 8 weeks or 9 weeks or old or whatever, we have actually smacked ourselves in the face or whatever. And so when the brain recognizes that it's about to have impact or concussion, it produces what we call a flinch. And a flinch is simultaneously, we typically close our eyes because it's imperative that we protect our eyes, and that's genetically built into us. And at the same time, we try to move away from the explosion or get our body away from the explosion. Well, this, when we're shooting any kind of firearm, produces a flinch. And the way that people historically have gotten over the flinch, or not really gotten over the flinch at all, but how they deal with the flinch, is they acquire this, what we call a surprise break. And what takes place is, if the subconscious mind is not aware of exactly when the weapon's going to fire, it still flinches, but it flinches after the shot. It flinches because of the actual concussion and not because it's anticipating the concussion. And so that's why that people that don't understand how firearms and how firearms training work revert back to the precision type of shooting. And they can talk somebody through a shot, and they talk about confirming and aligning the weapon and press, and trigger. And when they fire the shot, they hit the target, and they pat him on the back and said, "You did such a great job. All you have to do is remember to do this." Well, unfortunately, what we're doing is we're training the subconscious mind that we have all this time. We're training it that we need to see stability, and that we need to have a surprise break each time in order to hit the target. And all of that accounts for time. And so we don't have all that time when we're shooting live birds or trap or skeet or anything else. And we don't have that time in real life when we're engaging someone that's popping up over the hood of a car and giving us a shot, an accurate shot within a half a second. We don't have the time to do the precision type of shooting, and those precision shooting skills break down under that type of situation. And it's only reactive skills that actually work. So how do we deal with overcoming the concussion? And here's the problem, is because the subconscious mind knows the solution of the shot. It knows precisely when the guns are going to fire. And I tell people, it doesn't matter whether you've got a 4-pound trigger or a 10-pound trigger. It does not matter. As long as the trigger is consistent, the brain will quickly know exactly what it's going to require to fire that shot. And it's going to fire that shot instantaneously. But because it knows precisely when the shot's going to break, if we have a flinch situation, we are flinching prior to the shot. We call it pre-ignition push. And basically that just simply means that we close our eyes and we push the weapon because we anticipate the concussion. And the result is that, number one, we don't see the hit because we don't hit the target. And number two is we don't see the hit because our eyes are closed. And number three, we don't hit the target because as we close our eyes, we move the weapon. We're trying to move the concussion away from us. And so the historic flinch is a real problem. And, if you read anything about Ed McGivern, which was the most famous reactive shooter in history, this guy was capable of throwing 6 1-inch diameter glass balls in the air. drawing a Model 10 Smith & Wesson revolver and breaking all 6 of those with a solid bullets, not rat shot or anything else, but with solid bullets. He's breaking these things in the air, all 6 of them. So if you read about what he's talking about, he talks about how you have to overcome the situation. And so historically, the way I was raised, and again, I was shooting from the time I was 6 years old. And my dad was in the Air Force. He was on the Air Force Skeet Team. So obviously, I grew up shooting moving targets. I had never shot a stabilized target. I had never shot a bullseye target until I went into the FBI. And so all of the targets I had always shot up until that point were moving targets. And the targets, if you did not engage them quickly, you didn't get them. And so we're shooting raccoons out of citrus trees, and I'm shooting gar in the water from a moving boat, and all of this. And so in order to accomplish and learn these skills, we built nothing but moving targets. And we recognized at an early age that if you can't see the impact of the target or the result of your hit, we didn't understand the psychology and the physiology of all of this at the time. We were just in the country and trying to figure out how to learn how to shoot live birds and quail and dove and all the other things that we're involved in. And it figured out is we have to create a target that acts like these targets. And so we create a target that can move radically, move in an unpredictable manner and so forth. We can learn how to shoot that just like we can learn how to shoot a dove and quail and so forth. And so that's in a nutshell, how we do that. How we started that is we started off shooting like 22 caliber handguns and rifles. And so what people didn't recognize is that we were doing it because it was inexpensive, it was cheap. And so once we learned how to do that, then we could move up and shoot more expensive cartridges that were more lethal to the things we were trying to shoot. But in essence, what we had learned is the subconscious mind had become comfortable with the concussion of a 22. And so the way we do our basic class for people who have never shot before is we use the same target system. We don't slow the targets down. They're the same size. They're moving at the same speed. But what we do is we start engaging those targets, and we start off with 22 and a 22 long rifle. But we use, to begin with, the subsonic 22 cartridges and or what we call standard velocity. And these have less concussion. And we put ear protection and hats on people and eye protection and so forth, and we do it outside so that we don't amplify the concussion. And what happens is people are motivated to see what happens when they pull the trigger. And the more that they're motivated, the more they're able to keep their eyes open and follow through and actually see the hit. And once this is accomplished, then we move up to a higher velocity 22, and then we move to like a super velocity 22 cartridge, and then we move to a center fire. And what I found is that we use weapons of the same size and shape. So we start off shooting LCR 22 Ruger revolvers, and it's important. I try to teach people that it's important to know how to pull the trigger in an instant without jerking the gun. And if you go to some people that are precision shooters, what they'll tell you is, well, in order for us to improve your shooting, you have to go to a lighter trigger pull. And so what they want to do is reduce the trigger pull to 2 pounds or 1.5 pounds or whatever. And all they're really trying to do is to fool the subconscious mind and not know when the gun's going to go off. Well, that's not our case. We know precisely when the gun's going to go off. And so what we have to do is we have to teach the mechanics. We have to teach physically how to pull the trigger in an instant, how to pull the trigger in a reaction response time. But we have to learn how to pull it without jerking the weapon. Well, the best way to do that is start off with a revolver. And so I start our basic class off, and we shoot nothing but revolvers in the morning. We start off shooting 22 revolvers. And then we graduate to a 22 semi-automatic, and I choose the Smith & Wesson M&P, because we're going to transition to a 9mm M&P, same grip, same trigger, same sights, same everything, same holster, and yet now we're shooting a centerfire cartridge. So what happens is, in a 3-day period of time, Instead of shooting 500 or 600 rounds, we shoot several thousand rounds of 22 ammunition. And so what the students are doing is they're learning that the concussion is not going to bother them. That they're adjusting to the concussion. They're training their entire nervous system that the concussion is not a real problem. And they're also motivating themselves to see the resulting hits. And so what they're doing is they're learning how to engage these targets with what we call flash sight picture. And their follow through is the positive instant recognition that allows the subconscious mind to know precisely how good a sight picture they need to have in order to shoot this target at whatever the distance is. And it's important we start off and we vary the distances within a few minutes. We're having them engage targets that are 7 yards, 10 yards, 12 yards, 15 yards, 18 yards, 22 yards away. Because if you only concentrate on one distance, as the brain realizes, well, this is what the sight picture has to look like, but it doesn't know what the sight picture has to look like at a different distance. And so the same sight picture that I'm trying to shoot at a target that's 25 yards away is certainly not, it's a different sight picture than I have shooting a target that's 10 yards away. And when I say it's different, it's less refined. I don't need to be perfectly refined in order to hit the target at 10 yards, but it has to be more stabilized, more refined to be able to hit it at 25 yards. And so the brain has got to make that determination, and it's all about prior experience. It's all about the positive instant recognition. It's just like if I were going to teach you to shoot trapper skeet, and I only introduce you to one target at one angle. What's your chances of shooting 25 out of 25 when I take you to skeet range? You would have to be able to shoot all of the targets at all of the distance, at all the angles, so that your brain recognizes exactly what the leads need to be. And instead of learning the leads so much, although we do have to lead the targets in some of our shooting, what the brain is trying to figure out is just how good the sight picture has to be, how stabilized it has to be in order for us to make the shot. But we're still pulling the trigger in that instant. We're still pulling the trigger in what we call human response time. And so that's why we start off teaching the revolver, so that we know how to pull the trigger as quickly as we can pull it, but the weapon stays stabilized, or as much as it can be, while we're firing the shot. So our solution is not to use lighter trigger pulls, which that seems to be the essence of most people's training, and that's because they're doing precision shooting, is they're trying to always get a surprise break. And of course, it's easier to get a surprise break when you have a 2-pound trigger pull than it is if you have a 10-pound trigger pull. But that's the difference in a nutshell between what we try to train, how we're training, and the difference in precision shooting. And I've had a lot of people come and tell me, this is really difficult. As a matter of fact, psychologically, I've got instructors, FBI instructors, I've got police instructors, I've got special forces people that have years and years of experience. And on the first day, they're demoralized because their brain wants to see a stabilized target. It wants to see a stabilized weapon and a sight picture and all this. It's not going to happen on a range. And so what takes place is that's very disconcerting to them. It's very frustrating to them. And so it takes me an hour or so to finally intimidate these people to start shooting at the target, because they don't want to shoot at it. It's in their own mind, it's not good enough for them to make the shot, and so they don't shoot at the target. We call them they're chasing the target. The target moves, they chase the target, they start to pull the trigger, target goes away, they never fire a shot. But in time, we force them to start shooting until they begin to hit the target. And once they begin to hit the target, then we have, the learning curve goes up dramatically. But it takes us 3 days before we really begin to accomplish much of this in our type of shooting. And I've got people that say, well, why don't you take and slow the targets down? Instead of running them at a half a second, why don't you run them at 1.5 seconds like everybody else does? And the problem is that the brain has almost perfect timing. If I ran the drill 5 times, your brain would know precisely what 1.5 seconds is. And it would take 1.5 seconds in order to shoot the shot, because there's no motivation to shoot it faster. Well, the problem is, in a short period of time, your brain becomes comfortable with that. And now when I turn this target speed up, you're lost again. So all it would do is cost us a lot of ammunition, a lot of time. And again, when you go to a skeet range, they don't put a frisbee target on there and turn the speed down half speed. That's not the way they teach. They throw the target out the same speed and you learn how to deal with it. And that's the quickest and best way for us to teach those skills.
You touched on so many incredibly fascinating and insightful things there, and I want to clarify a little bit for the people who listen who don't have a shooting background, and then maybe ask you to clarify a point that I thought was really interesting. So, just for the people who don't have a shooting background, this is really a proxy for the part whole training conversation where when in skill acquisition, whenever you're trying to develop a complex skill like shooting that has so many variables, oftentimes what people do is they try to break down that skill into the component parts by creating drills. And in the shooting world, how they tend to teach beginners how to shoot, because the idea is that if you have someone who's never fired a gun before, like you're trying to train a police academy, the worst case scenario for a new officer or any officer is to have to draw a firearm on an adversary in a crowded place, moving target, innocent people around. And the idea is you can't teach somebody to shoot in that complex an environment. You have to break it down by shooting at paper targets and doing stationary drills, and then sort of build yourself up to the more dynamic, complex environment where there are more variables. But Bill, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is, and what I wanted to ask you, and I think you kind of touched on it, obviously your Rogers range that you kind of talked about a little bit is a pretty advanced course of fire. You have very high standards, moving targets, very strict time windows where the targets present themselves. And I was going to ask you, when you're taking a novice shooter, you're not going to put them on the Rogers range on day one, but do you see any kind of a place for these traditional marksmanship drills where you're shooting at a stationary target, you don't really have any time constraints? And if I'm listening to you correctly, what you're saying is even for a novice shooter who's never fired a gun before, you still don't see much of a role for these very sort of artificial type marksmanship based drills for more of a law enforcement or military type shooter. Am I correct in saying that?
What I'm saying, I think you're incorrect in saying that we don't start a beginning shooter on the Rogers range. We do.
Okay.
We start somebody that's never picked up a firearm before. We start them on the first day, the first hour, the first minute, and we start them on a target that's operating at a half a second exposure, an 8-inch diameter target.
Okay.
And we start off by dry firing. We allow them to dry fire so that they can work the trigger, and we work on their stance, and we work on their grip, and we work on them to make sure that they keep both eyes open. That's another fallacy that everybody, we got like 11 or 12% of the people in the United States are left-handed, but 40% of the people are what we call cross-eye dominant, which means that their left eye is dominant and they've been talked into being right-handed. Well, that's a real problem for us. And so we just simply take and put the weapon in their left hand. We put the weapon underneath their dominant eye to start off with. And so we simply teach them, you're going to lift this weapon. It's not going to be aimed at the target. We don't allow them to start aimed at the target. In fact, they have to start aimed in a safe direction, about a 45 degree to the ground. And so the target operates, it's going to be exposed for half a second. And it's only an 8-inch diameter target. But they have to lift up. And as they lift up, they're in the process of firing the weapon from the start. Okay, so as they're lifting, they're steering, they're pulling the trigger, much like a baseball player. I try to do an example because I played baseball all the way up to college, and so I tell people, so when do you start actually swinging the bat at the ball? When the ball is 10 feet away from you, and the answer is no. You start the swing based on the delivery of the pitch. And so you've got, and it turns out to be, you've got right, when the ball's traveling around 90 miles an hour, you have right at a half a second in order to hit the ball. And so you start your swing, and from that point on, you're steering the bat. You can speed the swing up, you can slow the swing down, you can extend the bat, you can do all of these things as you're swinging, but your object is to connect with that ball before it passes over the plate. We do the same thing with the handgun. We are pulling the trigger. Especially with the revolvers. As I'm lifting the weapon, I'm working the trigger. If you look at it in slow motion, you will actually see the cylinder start to spin as I lift this weapon up. But my brain is timing the shot. And it really doesn't matter whether I'm shooting a revolver or semi-automatic. The same difference is going to happen. My brain starts working the trigger as I lift the weapon. And when it sees the correct sight picture, it initiates the final action, the final shot. Just like the baseball player, he's swinging the bat. And when his brain says this ball is breaking outside, he can stop the swing just like I can stop the trigger pull. If I decide that the shot's impossible, it's gone or whatever, I can't shoot a shot at a target that's not there. That's a penalty at our range. And so you've got to learn that you're in the process of shooting. But yes, we start the basic shooter, never picked up a gun before, and we start them in that essence. And what we do is we graduate them later on into allowing them to shoot at a paper target at a little bit longer distance. And the only reason we do that is because in many cases, that's the only way that they are tested. They're tested not at shooting on a steel target range. And so we want them to experience that you have to be able to shoot on a cardboard target for score. But at the same time, you're using the same techniques. And I've had people come through our class that are beginning, never shot before, and then get accepted into a police academy. And they'll call me up and they said, you can't believe what happened today. We're in our second week at the police academy, and they had a simple drill, and the target popped up, and I shot this perfect group in 1 second on the drill and reloaded. And I had instructors come up and tell me, you're crazy. You've got to slow down. You can't do this. And I said, well, look at my target. And they said, well, I don't care. You can't do this. You can't shoot like this. You're disturbing the rest of the shooters. And so that's the problem, is that you should have, in my mind, if you're going to train somebody other than, if you're going to train somebody to be defensive and or like a police officer defending themselves, or even a civilian, that we're talking about really a life-saving skill. This is not bullseye. This is not IMSA shooting. This is not Olympic style. It's not free pistol. It's none of those. It is more realistic to bird hunting. It's more realistic to the fact that you've only got an instant and the target's going to probably be moving, and it may be advancing and may be trying to run over your position. And so we have to be able to deal in those times. And when you historically look at the shootouts that we've had, the FBI shootout in Miami is one of those classic things that shows that 114 bullets are fired and the distance is like two vehicle widths, and they're not hitting the target. They're not hitting these guys. These guys are only up for a half a second, 3/4 of a second, and they're delivering pretty accurate fire. And so you've got a cadre of people that have never been trained to experience this, and yet somehow or another, I mean, if you go through all of the police academies, just about all the police academies, the fastest shot that they're going to have, and this is with a weapon out of the holster, not in the holster, not aimed at the target to start with, but in a safe direction. But the fastest shot they have, even if they time it, is 1.5 seconds, and that's across the board. And so now the subconscious mind is only comfortable in shooting in 1.5 seconds. So we never allow that to happen. We start off with the target's only going to expose for a half a second. You learn how to deal with it. And then what happens is the brain recognizes as the target gets smaller and as the target gets further away, then the weapon has got to be stabilized a little bit more in order for us to hit the target. How does it learn that? It learns it by doing. It learns it by shooting and recognizing, I didn't hit that target. So I've got to do something different. And then when you finally hit the target, your brain says, hey, you know what? At that distance, at that size target, this is how stabilized the weapon needs to look like. And this is how precise the sight needs to look like. So in essence, what we're teaching is a kind of a modified precision shooting, but we're still not giving you 1.5 seconds. You've got to do all of this. But what the good thing is that the brain recognizes that if it's at 10 yards, that's a totally different deal. The sights don't have to be totally stabilized or precise. But the problem is that when we teach somebody, like you start off with a cardboard target, I don't allow it. We don't start that. We don't allow them to shoot a cardboard target until the end of the class at all. And so what we're trying, and we don't give them any time. we never allow them to shoot in their own time. Now, don't get me wrong, a shooter must have precision skills by the time they get into as an experienced shooter. If you can't shoot a group, a relatively good group, then you can't adjust the sights of your weapon, you can't test the ammunition, you can't test the ballistics of the gun and the accuracy. You have to be able to make a precision shot, because at the speeds we're shooting, I'm not shooting a 1-inch group. I'm lucky to shoot a 4-inch group or 5-inch group at 10 yards. That's my essence. If I'm shooting in a half a second, I'm happy with a 4-inch group. If I was precision shooting at that distance, I wouldn't be happy unless the bullets were touching each other. But there's the difference. The difference is my brain is not trying to shoot a 1-inch group. My brain is trying to hit this target in a half a second. And once it learns how to do that, then I'm a very capable shooter. And this is why we got the contract to train the Navy SEALs, how we, Army Delta owns 7 of our ranges, and we just installed our second range at the FBI Academy. There, we've got ranges for the Marine Corps and the Navy, and we've got and they now understand the importance. And unfortunately, most people still don't. They'll still train people in the classic way of taking plenty of time and shooting at a cardboard target, and then they magically think that something is going to speed them up and have them be able to shoot at a target that's only exposed for brief periods of time, is only a partial target. And what happens to me is it takes us 3 or 4 days of breaking that habit. So our tests and our program is the same for a shooter that's never shot before, or an advanced shooter that's in the military, a Navy SEAL, or an experienced SWAT. Same program. The only difference is that we start off with a shooter that's never shot before, and we shoot nothing but 22s for the first 3 days, and we work them into shooting. But the speed of the target's the same. And so, and I would love to be able to train the Navy and the Army and everybody else the same way. But for whatever reason, psychologically, they say, oh, no, we can't show up and shoot at 22. And the other problem is that with the exception of the M&P 22 out there, I don't know any 22s that are reliable enough for us to do the same thing that we do with our classes. And so, I'm not here trying to sell Smith & Wesson M&P 22s, but we shot those guns 2,500 rounds without cleaning them, without having a failure. They're amazing 22 gun. A regular blowback type 22 gun usually fails after about 300 rounds. There's enough powder residue and so forth. They just stop running. These guns don't. So we can run our tests, we can run all of our drills, and it's amazing what we can get done. But it's that attitude, it's that idea that actually trains people quickly. Now, are they bullseye shooters? No. Are they IMSHA shooters? Are they free pistol shooters? No. But they're pretty dadgum good at IPSC shooting, and they're great at IDPA type of shooting, because they're now they're shooting in as fast as they can shoot, and they're still hitting the target. So it's a different discipline. And again, if you're looking at shooting sports, it's totally different. It's like comparing bench rest shooting to trapper skeet. You're shooting a rifle, or maybe a better analogy would be to try to compare IPSC shooting with bullseye shooting. In bullseye shooting, the fastest shot we have is rapid fire. And that's one shot. You shoot 5 shots in 10 seconds. So it's one shot in 2 seconds. Well, if you can't do an El Presidente, which is 2 shots on a target, 2 shots on another target, 2 shots on another target, or reload, 2 shots on the same target, 2 shots on another, you're talking about 3 targets with 4 shots on each target with a reload. If you can't do that now in 5 seconds, you might as well not even show up to the match. And so that's the difference in comparing the types of shooting. It's a different type of training. That's in our type of shooting, it's not a sport. We're not teaching a sport. We're trying to teach survival skills.
No, I think a good analogy is almost like traditional martial arts with very static and predictable forms, to fighting in like an MMA match. It's just two. It's not that one's better than the other. They're two different things. So I appreciate the clarification, and I just want to make a point for the people again who don't have much of a firearms background. What you're saying is so radical because you're talking about taking the same exact starting point, the same exact course of fire for people in the military who have been selected for a special operations type job and have had firearms instruction, albeit the kind that might differ from what you would teach. And you're having them show up at your range and do the exact same course of fire as somebody who's never picked up a gun before, which again, I mean, I'm having you here because I kind of agree with that, what's considered unorthodox methodology. I think that if anything, it should be more orthodox because you're much more, I think, respectful of the type of context and situations where a military or law enforcement officer is going to have to draw a firearm. But it's still radical because no one else is doing it. So if you can clarify one more time, if in your ideal world, assuming the people that you were training didn't have to do their quarterly or semi-annually firearms test on a stationary target, for law enforcement and military, would you do any static shooting at all?
Well, static shooting is on a cardboard target. The only reason I see that you do that at all is so that you can actually use a scoring system, that it's easier to score. So that's the only possible reason you would do that. And it's only because that is what has been taught forever that they're still doing that. If you go to your state and look and see what the qualification course is for their law enforcement people, they shoot it once a year, twice a year, whatever. If you'll look at the times, they're insanely slow. As a matter of fact, in most states, it's like at 5 yards away. Okay, at 5 yards away, you have like two seconds, 1.5 seconds, or 2 seconds to fire a shot. Okay, and I tell people at 5 yards away, I can advance with a crowbar and kill you faster than that. And so if you look at the speeds that they're testing, they're ridiculously slow, and they're shooting at a target that's man size, and they're scoring if you hit somewhere in the upper torso. Well, you can hit people in the shoulder, you can hit people in the stomach, you can hit people peripheral all over. In fact, I can show you case after case of people that have been shot multiple times in the upper torso that have actually killed a police officer or killed somebody else. So that kind of training and giving you plenty of time to do that is not going to create somebody that's going to be successful in most of the gun battles that we run into. Most of the gun battles, bad light, surprise situations, are relatively close, and it's over. It's over in sub-seconds. So these are the situations that if you're not trained for, all that is you're training. It would be like if you're going to teach your youngster how to drive. And so you take them out and you teach them how to shift gears or whatever, and you allow them to drive at like 30 miles an hour. And you take them out on a big track and you put cones out there, but you govern the car so that it'll only go 30 miles an hour. And so for 5 days, they drive and they have obstacles that run out in front of them. But they can't go over 30 miles an hour. So now what happens when they now are in a vehicle and they're on the expressway and they're doing 85 miles an hour just to keep from getting run over? And they got idiots that are tailgating them, and they got water that begins to come out of the rain on the ground. What happens to them now? It's because all of they have been trained is to deal with 30 miles an hour and going around cones. And now all of a sudden they've got the realistic problems of dealing with what's going to happen in real life. And that's the problem that I see, that almost all of the training that I see in the firearms industry with law enforcement and even the basic military situations is these folks have been taught a skill that is not practical in real life. And it's a handicap. Like I say, in most of the cases that I have, we do better with a person that has never shot before. They don't have bad habits. I do better with kids that are 14, 15 years old that have never shot before. And I have these guys that are qualifying or shooting high scores on our same test than I do the guys that have got 15 years or firearms instructors that have 15 years or 20 years and they're teaching it. And yet those guys in many cases will not pass. And they can't pass because it takes them 3 or 4 days just to break the habits. They're so uncomfortable with what we're doing. You know, if you go to most police ranges, and sometimes it's really irritates me. They'll have a sign up on the like the range door or whatever. It says, "Do not place your finger on the trigger until the sights are clear on the target." Okay, well, if that's the case, you'll never pass at my school. There's no way you're going to pass. We're in the process of shooting that weapon. Once I make a decision to shoot that target, I'm in the process of shooting. I'm lifting the weapon, working the trigger. The gun's going to go off when the flash sight picture is there. The gun's going to fire. And so, another thing that I see is that because of many of the last 10 or 15 years, everybody's gone to semi-automatics, and a lot of people are shooting Glock pistols, is I'll have these people, they'll fire a shot because they've got lots of training. They'll fire a shot at the target, and instantly their finger is outside of the trigger guard in position on the slot of the weapon, okay, because that's what they've been taught. Unfortunately, they miss the target. You know, and for us, it's, you know, they're used to shooting at a cardboard target. Well, a cardboard target doesn't respond whether you hit it or don't hit it, you know, and so they're told you will shoot 2 shots. We have no such thing. In our drills, there is no such thing as 2 shots, 3 shots, or 4. You will shoot until you hit the target or it goes away. It's that simple. And it's not good enough to hit the target. You've got to knock the target over. So if you hit a peripheral hit or a low hit, like on the chin or, you know, just a peripheral hit, you won't knock the target over. Well, guess what? You're not allowed to leave it. You've got to shoot until you knock the target over. So these people show up to my range, target pops up, they shove the weapon out, they jerk the trigger. Now they have their finger outside of the trigger guard, positioned safely on the slot, but they haven't hit the target. And so just to break them of that habit takes almost a day. And so you know, and in fact, many cases, and this is really upsetting to me, is that we'll have people, the target pops up, they'll drive the weapon out, fire the shot, but the target's already gone down. And I'll say to them, you just fired a shot at a target that was gone. And I said, you know, we're responsible for every shot that leaves the muzzle. And so in this case, this bullet's going down range. You know, in real life, it's a street or it's a building. It's an office. It's a hospital. There's a floor out there that this bullet's going to eventually ricochet off of and possibly hit somebody. So you just can't shoot at a target that's gone. But what's happened is they're used to doing that with a cardboard target because it's still there. And so, you know, and such bad habits that I see. And in our case, we have to teach them that they have to engage the closest target first. Well, I got guys that have been closing one eye forever because they didn't have an instructor that recognized they were cross-eye dominant. And so they have them close one eye. Well, now this is really difficult because as soon as you close one eye, you lose 50% of your peripheral vision. Your nose blocks your vision. So they don't see the target that's just next to them to the left because they got their left eye closed. And so they're now engaged in a target that's like 15 yards away, and there's a target that's like 7 yards away that's like in bayonet range, and they don't even see it. And so these are all habits that we run into with people that have been trained conventionally by people that actually think they know something about shooting. And it's really disappointing for me because I have these conversations with the people, and they think I'm absolutely crazy. And I have departments that the administrative people say, you know, you're whacked out because one of the things that we do is all of our drills are based on hitting the head target. So even on the close targets, if we shoot the body, we only shoot 2 shots until we hit the body, and then we have to shoot the head because in close confined areas with a handgun cartridges are puncture wounds. They cause people to bleed out, but sometimes that takes minutes. As evidenced by the case down in Miami. We got a guy that shot underneath the heart He's not going to survive, but you know what? For the next minute and 45 seconds, he shoots and kills people. So when you're trying to deal with someone that's trying to kill you up close, we don't continue to shoot at the torso. We have to have the discipline that the torso shots have not stopped. So we're immediately going to the head, because we know if we connect with a head shot, we're going to stop this guy instantaneously. If we enter a shot through the nose canal, the eye canal, the ear canal, we're going to stop this guy instantaneously, and it's over. So that's our discipline. Well, I've got administrative people that say, well, we don't even teach our people to make a headshot. We can't convince the public that if we were making headshots out there, that we wouldn't get a lot of criticism. And I say, so you're only going to shoot to hurt people. You're only interested in harming people, not stopping people. And so there are so many things that are wrong when you look at how law enforcement is trained, that it's taken me a lifetime to try to change it. And many departments I have been able to change, but for the majority, number one, they're not going to adopt our type of program. They've been into cardboard targets and staples, and they've been doing this for so many years that they're just not likely. And the other thing too is that the firearms instructors that are presently teaching, they can't do our skills. And so they're not likely to set up a target system that requires them to shoot in these speeds, because they can't demo it. And one of the things that I insist, I'm 72 years old, but I do the demos on the first day of every drill. Every drill I step up and shoot, including the test. All of the tests, I demo the test before anybody else shoots it. I'm doing it for several reasons. Number one is I want them to look at the style and the way we approach things. And number two, as I want them to be assured that since I'm still 72 years old, I can accomplish this. I can shoot an 8-inch diameter target to 22 yards away in 3/4 of a second. Because if you couldn't do it, these guys all step up. In fact, the first minute that I run the target's up for a half a second. First drill, it runs up for a half a second. And as soon as I step up there and I say, folks, I'm going to demonstrate this drill. But I said, before I shoot it, I'm going to operate the target. I operate the target. I look down the line at the people, and these people are catching their breath. They're like saying, this is impossible. And then I go ahead and I shoot the target. I shoot it 6 times. I hit the target 6 times. It's 8-inch diameter target. It's up for half a second. Well, now we've dispelled the notion that it can't be done. And so now people begin to listen. Oh, well, maybe we better follow what this guy's talking about in order to do this. And I've had so many units that come through. That's exactly what happened. By lunchtime, these guys are frustrated. By dinner time, they got their face in their soup. They're not even talking. And then finally somebody speaks up and says, hey, you know what? If this guy can do it, we can do it. And so let's get over this nonsense, this frustration, us bitching and complaining, and let's get down to learning how to do this. And that's the essence of it, is that you just have to buckle down. And again, it's just like if you're going to teach your youngster how to hit a baseball, is you don't go out there and throw him a volleyball real slow. You're going to go out there and you're going to start trying to throw the ball at the speed that his counterpart is going to be throwing the ball. And what I try to figure out, when I taught my grandkids how to play baseball, is I bought a ball machine, and I figured out the speed that the pitchers are going to be throwing in Little League. And I take and set this thing up, and I start throwing it, and they start swinging until finally they connect. And when they connect, I throw that ball in the same spot a whole bunch of times. And then I begin to throw it outside. I begin to throw it low. I begin to throw it high. I throw it inside. And then once they get comfortable with it, I have them switch hands. Okay, well, now we're going to learn how to bat left-handed. And we do the whole same process again. So it's the same policy of the way that I teach shooting, is that you actually figure out what is going to be their requirement. Well, their requirement is they're going to have to be able to hit a ball that's doing 45 miles an hour, okay, a hard ball. So why go out there and throw the ball at 10 miles an hour in a lob? You're not teaching them anything. They're learning a bad habit. So, the way firearms is taught is the same, unfortunately, would be the same way if you'd go out there and say, okay, guys, I'm going to try to teach you how to hit a ball, but we're going to take and throw a big ball and we're going to slow it down until you get comfortable at hitting. And then we're going to go and play a game. Well, it doesn't work that way. But unfortunately, that's the way that, and again, most of that is because people, I tell people I could teach you how to hit the number one target in my range with a slingshot. With a slingshot, with it not at pulled back and not aimed at the target. I could teach you how to hit that in the half a second. I could teach you how to do it with a bow and arrow, same way. Faster than I could teach you how to do it with a handgun. And here's why. None of those explode. And I tell people, I could teach you how to hit a baseball. But you think about it. I can teach you how to hit this baseball pretty quickly, but what happens if the baseball exploded every time you hit the ball? And that's when the flinch takes over. That's when what we call an overpressure event. And this is what has been the mystery that has been a problem for firearms training for the longest time, is that instructors didn't recognize that the flinch was caused not by the recoil of the weapon unless it was hurting somebody. It's caused by the concussion. And so you have to learn how to deal with the concussion. And the way you learn how to deal with the concussion is the way you teach all subconscious things, is by a correct repetition. So you've got to get them to fire the gun the first time without flinching. And once you do that, then you build on that. And so the way you do that, again, I tell people, if I could put a suppressor on their handguns, I could teach them how to shoot our drills in one day. If the gun was not exploding and causing this concussion, they would learn these drills like people saying, well, hey, I got a kid that can take and shoot aspirins with an airsoft gun. No kidding. I could take and teach somebody how to do our drills with airsoft within a few hours. We don't have concussion. So it's all about dealing with concussion, because it's the concussion that causes people to close their eyes, push the weapon away from, pull the trigger, miss the target. And that's when the instructor says, oh, well, that's not working, but we do know what works. What works is you stabilize everything, you take a deep breath, you expel the breath, you press the trigger, and if that doesn't work, we'll get you a lighter trigger pull. We're all trying to do this, and so that you will hit the target. Well, guess what? You're still flinching, but the flinch is after the shot, and that's not helping you deal with the situation at hand.
Yeah, and that's really important, because you've mentioned the subconscious mind quite a few times, and I remember when I was coming up and learning how to shoot, and even now, not that I've shot in a while since I got out of the military, but I always had the error of a right-handed shooter of shooting down and to the left, and I was always told by the instructor, you're anticipating the trigger squeeze, and they said it as if like, okay, so I am aware of the error that I'm making, but I'm not doing it consciously, and they're giving me a conscious cue. Their cue was, don't anticipate, as if I can just consciously tell myself not to do it, and now that makes it better.
That's right. Impossible. That's impossible, because the subconscious mind is going to learn things not by what it read. It's not going to learn things by listening to an instructor. It's not going to learn things by watching a video. It can only learn by doing. Now, the conscious mind, on the other end, is different. I can talk you through how to do a malfunction clearing. I can talk you how to load your weapon and so forth. I can talk you through that. But if I put you under stress and I say, now you only have 3/4 of a second to do that reload drill, you'll find yourself hopelessly in trouble. And so the subconscious mind has to learn how to do the drill. And so part of the drill is learning not to flinch. But you can, and I in my lecture,
but you can't just tell somebody not to flinch. You have to create an environment where they don't do it.
It's like I start off the lecture when I'm talking about concussion. I said, okay, while I'm doing this, I've reached under the table and I press a button, and we have a flashbang that goes off under the table. What's going to be the reaction to everybody here? And they say, you will all jump up and all scream and all holler and whatever. Yes, that's correct. I said, now what happens if I tell you that in the next 5 minutes, another one's going to go off? But I want you to tell yourself, I will not flinch, I will not flinch, I will not flinch. I said, is there anybody here naive enough to think that when that bomb goes off, you're not going to flinch? And the answer is no, we're all going to flinch, because we can't solve the problem consciously. We have to solve the problem by correct repetition. And that's why I tell people, I get guys that say, well, we do a drill where we randomize a live round.
Dummy rounds, yeah.
Dummy round. Yeah. And I say, well, what do you mean by doing that? Oh, we take and put one live round and then 2 dummy rounds and then maybe 3 dummy rounds, a live round. And I said, that won't work. That doesn't solve our problem. And here's why it doesn't solve the problem is because when you come across that surprise, in most cases, you're going to flinch. And so what we do is totally different than that. We alternate. It's always ball dummy, ball dummy, ball dummy, ball dummy, ball dummy for a couple of magazines. And it's trying to teach you to get over the flinch. So what takes place is that you pull the trigger, the gun goes bang. You pull the trigger the next time and it goes click, but you flinch it. So now your mind says, well, I know the next one's a live fire. So you've probably flinched that one in two. But the next time your brain says, this one is a dummy. And so you don't want to look stupid. And so you try to follow through. And so then what happens is you run the targets the same speed, so you're not giving them any extra time. And so if you force them to do this ball dummy, ball dummy, ball dummy, after about the third magazine, the brain finally says, you know what? I don't care if the gun goes off or not. I don't want to move the gun. I want to see the gun stabilized after the shot. And that's when you begin to teach them how to deal with the flinch. Obviously, we start off with the 22 because, and then we graduate to the centerfire. When we graduate to the centerfire, that's what we do. We have them do several.
Why a 22 for people who don't know what that is?
Okay, well, the 22 is a 22 long rifle is what we're talking about. It's a cartridge, and it's very, very small. It has a 40 grain bullet, which is a very small, light bullet, and it has a light powder charge. And so because it's got such a light powder charge, it doesn't have the effects of the major concussion. When you're shooting a 9mm, you got 40,000 PSI, 40,000 pressure curve that's going to bust out of the muzzle. And that pressure curve is coming back toward you. You're feeling that compression. You're feeling that pressure. We don't have that with a 22. It's not as easy to shoot as like an airsoft or a BB gun. I got people say, hey, how come I can shoot a BB gun and I can shoot airsoft and I can shoot a laser and I can shoot my targets and I can shoot them all these speeds, but then when I start shooting a real gun, I have problems. Well, it's because you haven't conditioned yourself to the concussion problem. And so, again, you may be learning how to work the trigger and how to see the sights clearly, but you're not learning how to deal with concussion. And like I say, the easiest thing to do is you can put a suppressor on it. My grandkids, I have a licensed suppressor for a bunch of guns. And so what I do is with my grandkids, when they're 6 or 7, I set up a bunch of balloons and potatoes and all that thing, and I let them shoot. And I let them shoot a 22, but I put a suppressor on it. Well, it's like shooting a water gun for them, and they're out there just knocking these targets down and hitting the balloons and hitting the potatoes and having a great time, and they're doing it, in sub-seconds. But if as soon as I take the suppressor off, because they're still young, even the concussion of the 22 disturbs them. But in time, they get used to that, and in time, I introduce them to the 22 cartridge. And they start off shooting at a rifle, which the concussion is further away from them. And then I graduate to a handgun. And then you can take small children, and in a short period of time, you can make advanced shooters out of them just by doing this. And you're also trying to teach them the safety aspects. I mean, it's so concerning to me that people are the first thing they're talking about in safety is the trigger. Oh, you've got to be conservative. No, the primary safety in all firearms is not the trigger. It's the muzzle direction. You got to make sure that you're never pointing the muzzle at anything that you don't intend to hurt or disturb. And so even when you're dry firing, you don't aim it at your dog and the TV and the cat and the kid across the street. These are things that you've learned to begin with at young ages, and if you discipline them correctly, even if they do finally make a mistake and fire an accidental shot, they don't hit anybody. They shoot it into a berm or they shoot it in a concrete wall or whatever. So that's the other disturbing thing that I see is that law enforcement, everybody else is so important about trying to put the pressure on, don't put your finger on the trigger, and they're aiming the guns at people. If you look at some of the real cop shows with cameras, they got 3 guys in a triangle aiming their firearm at this individual who's wearing a bathing suit. I mean, it's just absolutely ludicrous. We don't allow them to move the weapon from a safe direction until they have committed that they're going to make the shot. The weapon is aimed in a safe direction, aimed at the ground in a safe direction until they've decided that this is the target they're going to shoot. And then once they move the weapon, they're in a process of shooting. And it makes a whole lot of, I don't have time in this to go into the many more tactical reasons for doing that. But for legality reasons, for tactical reasons, for safety reasons, you should never, ever point the firearm at somebody unless you have made the decision you're going to shoot them and you're in the process of shooting them. The weapon should be in a safe direction, beside you or behind you, aimed at the ground until you've made the decision you're going to shoot. And then once you make that decision to shoot, the shot's accomplished, and it's and again, people think that it takes too much time. It takes the same amount of time. The time that it takes for somebody to put their finger in the trigger and pull the trigger is the same amount of time that it takes me to lift the weapon from a safe direction, put my finger in the trigger and pull the trigger. Same time. If you time it, it's precisely the same time. But in my case, the weapon is in a safe direction until I've made the decision to shoot. And I'm not likely to shoot the wrong person, what happens when somebody aims at a gun and says, don't move or I'll shoot. And then all of a sudden out of the corner of their eye, they see another individual that's about to draw a weapon. They subconsciously shoot the wrong person because they've already given their brain the situation. If they see violent motion, they'll make a shot. So it's part of the training that I see that takes us several days to break those habits. But anyway, it's a difficult thing for people to understand. But if they would just apply the same skill training that they have in hockey or in baseball or any of the other sports that they do with shooting, and if they just understood that what's crippling and what's different about those is the concussion. So we have to learn how to deal with concussion. But once we do that, everything else is the same. You don't take a fencer and teach him drills without sparring with somebody. And you don't have him, if he wants to be a high caliber fencer, you don't have him fence with somebody that's never fenced before or somebody that's really slow or retarded. You've got to have him fence with somebody that's as good as he is in order for him to improve. And so it's realistic speeds. It's realistic actions. That's what is important. And so, we've talked about shooting skills, but the way to finally teach people how to deal with real life encounters is what I have emphasized to everybody. I can teach you how to shoot, but in order to learn how to deal with real life situations, we have got to create the situation where you're not shooting with real live weapons. But we have a cadre of instructors that are not playing games. This is not a game playing situation. This is, if you do everything right, there will not be a shooting. But if you screw up, I'm going to be able to draw my weapon and kill you. But obviously I'm using simunition. I'm not using a real bullet. But that's how you learn. But first you have to learn the shooting skills. You got to learn how to be able to draw a weapon from a safety holster and hit a moving target in 1.5 seconds. We have to work our guys into by Wednesday. These people are working out of a holster and they're capable of hitting the target, not in 1/2 second, but 1.5 seconds from a holster. But the target's still moving, and it trips it, and they've got to be able to draw and engage that target. But it's that kind of skill that once you've got them so that they are confident that they can shoot, they're confident that they can shoot in the speeds that they can shoot, then you do simunition training. And you've got a cadre of good instructors that run it by the book. And, if you do a simunition drill where you ambush a police officer, you have not accomplished anything but demoralized him. We all will not survive a well-planned ambush. And that's not what police officers are typically running into. And if they run into an ambush, that's why we wear body armor, and that's why we practice as good a habits as we can. But what we're trying to deal with is how to survive the encounters that we stop a suspect, and all of a sudden we get the hunch that things are going bad, and we have to react to that, and we have to react in a sensible way of trying to deal with this so that nobody else gets hurt and we don't get hurt and we don't shoot somebody innocent. But that's to me, that's the kind of training that comes after, once you teach them the true firearm skills that they should know. But unfortunately, unfortunately, I see that we're taught with unrealistic shooting skills, and then they're put into simulation training, and much of that is not realistic. Um, it kind of disturbs me. I remember the first time that I encountered what they call a FATS system, which is scenarios that are projected up on a projector, and you're forced to deal with them. And so I can remember the first situation is I'm in this room and I'm walking toward the situation, and all of a sudden there's shots fired, and I see this guy backing out of a pawn shop, and it's clear that he's got a shoulder weapon. He's backing out slowly, but it's clear he's got a shoulder weapon. Well, I'm armed with a simunition revolver at this time in a holster. And as soon as I see this, I bolt for the door of this where I'm in this building, and I'm out of the door behind the wall of that door. And they said, "Oh, no, you can't do this. You can't. You got to deal with this situation." I said, "I have dealt with the situation. I'm 10 yards away from a guy that's backing out of here, and it's a shoulder. But I don't know. It could be a shotgun. It could be a submachine gun. We don't know. We've heard shots fired. And you expect me to challenge this guy in the middle of the street with my handgun? Not going to happen. And if you're teaching people that, it's bad habits." And so that's the sort of thing that kind of bugs me too, is that you've got to keep things realistic. You have to run them the way you would expect to happen in real life, and run them at the same speeds. And so I'm not convinced that the $1 million shoot houses, which are expensive, they're relatively dangerous, and nobody runs the drills at true speeds, because everybody's concerned about somebody getting shot with a real gun. And so what I see is you've dumped $1 million and you've got a 360 shoot house, and you've got supervisors in there that are trying to supervise to make sure nobody gets hurt and so forth, because you're shooting real live bullets. And to me, you don't run the drill as if you would run the drill in real life. You run it at slower speeds. You have different caveats. You got different safety instructors, and then still we get people hurt or killed, as evidenced by the fact that Navy SEAL got killed up in Mid-South. But to me, save your money. Rent an old warehouse, an old building that's got stairs and doors and offices, and do your simulation shooting there, so that you're teaching people. And you'll see people who make mistakes. They will make mistakes, but instead of being dead, they learn something, and you repeat it, and you do it over and over again until people get under the situation. They're under high stress, under high adrenaline. They're pushed in to make decisions, and they learn how to respond in a proper manner. That's the way it should be taught.
Okay, and that's a good segue into the last thing I want to go over, because initially we kind of talked about developing the shooter as an individual, and now we're getting kind of more into team tactics. So how would you structure, like, let's say you were in charge of a SWAT unit or a military assault unit. You've got unlimited resources in terms of range time, facilities, and even time. How would you kind of structure, kind of developing the individual shooters versus working on small unit tactics and CQB? What kind of a training plan would you have so you're developing both the individual and the team component simultaneously?
Well, the first thing you do is, like I said before, you teach them the shooting skills. And so that I'm confident that the only way that you can teach the shooting skills that are required for what they're capable or should be capable of doing is with reactive targets, steel targets that are moving. And it's just impossible in my mind. It's not impossible, but it's not realistic to do it with cardboard. Cardboard just doesn't respond like a target that gets hit and gets knocked over or doesn't get knocked over. We have to continue to shoot it. And so that's the first thing you do. You teach them how to be able to shoot in the times that they need to be able to shoot. And then what you do is you study, and we have so many classic cases that most of the departments are familiar with, but if not, you can pull them up from the FBI's report. But we have so many cases of instances where SWAT units have lost a guy. And so you study that scenario and you then reproduce that scenario with simulations. And so with a little bit of study, we can come up with 20 scenarios that caused a SWAT guy to get killed. So reproduce those and let them work as a team. And so you present to them not what the end result was of this case, but you present to them what that SWAT team was presented with. This is the entry that we have to make. These are how many hostages are involved. This is what the bad guy is. This is what he's armed with. Now, you guys, let's figure out how we're going to approach this. And here we're going to give the go sign, and we're going to do it. And you do it, and you debrief everybody, and you figure it out, and then you go back and do it again, and do it several times, and then you review what happened in real life so that people understand, and then you go to the next scenario. And so you need to do a week of that. In fact, what I do is, in the old days when we did a lot of simulation shooting, is I would do a week. Right now, what we do, a 5-day class, start on Sunday, end on Friday, of teaching them how to shoot. And then we went to buildings and we did simulation, and we ran scenario after scenario after scenario. And with police officers that are patrol officers, we'd set up a scenario, typical stop of a vehicle and what takes place. And all of a sudden, we had a situation where the two police officers were in a car, and I'd have the guy that's getting out of the car that's been stopped. He waits until the police officer approaches him, and he has his hands at his side. And when the guy approaches him, he quickly draws a gun and says, "I'm going to kill you if you move." And he turns him around and he says, "You're a hostage now, and I'm advancing your partner." And that's the worst situation you can find a police officer in, because now you've got this guy, and we do that, and with simulation, we got goggles and we got throat guards and we got groin guards, but we were just wearing sweatshirts and regular khakis, and I'd say to the guy, "I'm going to shoot you if you don't react. I'm just like real life, and it's going to hurt. So we're going to approach your partner." And so as I approached the partner, I'd be shoving this guy in front of me, and I'm making the commands to the partner: drop your gun, drop your gun, drop your gun, drop your gun. Well, you know what takes place is they take cover behind the vehicle. And even though we had gone over these scenarios before, is that anytime that you're in a situation where a hostage is being taken and you're the armed guy, is you got to boogie. You've got to get out of there. And unless you're capable of making the shot, which most people are not because it's too fluid to begin with, is you can't stand your ground and make a comment to the guy, "Well, don't know, you can't advance me," because what are you going to do? You're going to shoot the hostage? I don't think so. So what you've got to do is you've got to be fluid. You've got to boogie. You've got to get the hell out of the way so that he has lost this momentum. He has lost the ability to take your firearm, and now he's got a real problem. Do them as close as you can to what real life happens. Then they have experienced this. Again, you're teaching the subconscious mind to respond in a way that they've seen it happen before. They understand what's taking place. And if it's the first time that happens, it's a problem. And again, that's the way we train everybody else. I'm a pilot. And so the first thing you do is they teach you how to take off, they teach you how to turn, but then they start teaching you how to make landings, and they teach you how to make crosswind landings, and they make you land on different runways and so forth, and they do drills like shutting your engine down, and all of these things. And what they're trying to do is to try to teach you what happens in real life. And so you're doing, and a lot of times they're doing it with a simulator to teach you IFR and all the rest of that, flying on instruments. But again, unfortunately, it's just been recently that the world recognized that that's the way we should be training police officers is through simulating what's likely to happen in real life. And I don't agree with doing it with a one-dimensional photograph or a one-dimensional video. It needs to be real people. It needs to be real 3D. And that's what teaches people, because it's got to be a fluid. Things have got to happen based on what you just did. And you can't, it's difficult to get a simulator to respond that way. And it shouldn't happen the same each time. And that's why you got to have a good cadre of officers that are good actors, and they've had enough experience to know how to do this. And that's what we see the military is doing more and more, is they're, the real high-speed units, they're doing a whole lot of simulation training. That's what is important.
You've been so generous with your time, Bill. Where can people learn more about the work that you do, whether it's like on your website or social media, or even I think you've written a couple of books?
Yes, best thing to do is just go on my website. It's rogersshootingschool.com. So just spell it all together, rogersshootingandschool.com. And I have videos, I have books, and they can read about if they go on the information side, and we talk about the philosophy, much of what I've talked about here. But my book basically is a much longer version of what we've done in this brief lecture, and the same with my videos. I talk about what happens under stress and in the conditions you find yourself in, and why people make mistakes and all of that. But so yes, that's the best place for them to get the information.
Okay, yeah, and the whole idea behind this conversation is that your methodology transcends shooting. So I think your book is valuable for sport coaches and other kinds of educators and people who teach skill acquisition. So thanks again for all your time and have a great night.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. This podcast is brought to you by Resilient Performance Systems. If you enjoy the material here, please check out our website at www.resilientperformance.com and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future podcast episodes, articles, and upcoming content, including training templates and live and online courses. The sign-up link for the newsletter is in the show notes. Podcast listeners will receive a discount on all paid content by entering the coupon code PODCAST. That's PODCAST in all capital letters. Additionally, please consider writing an iTunes review if you find these podcast conversations informative. They help us continue to attract high-quality guests.